keyed the set as the alarm sounded, and my transmitter answered with a sick, unsteady needle. My report was already in the log, marked minor, left to wait behind louder demands. When the convoy took the hit, I watched my circuit die and felt the system tighten its grip around silence. I moved to the backup and sent the words anyway, knowing what those lost seconds could never return. Afterward, the forms were filed, the docket closed, and my warning stayed on the page. In early May 1943, the North Atlantic was still a working battlefield. Convoys continued to run between North America and the British Isles. The operational situation was defined by submarine contact reports, weather that could break formations, and the thin margin between routine passage and sudden loss. Escorts carried orders that were both practical and rigid. Keep the ships together, keep the radio discipline, assume the enemy was listening. One convoy assembled off the Canadian coast and began to push east. Merchant ships moved in columns at modest speed. An escort screen rode the outer arc, adjusting stations as seas rose and visibility collapsed. On one of the escorts, a small team was responsible for the ship's radio room, its transmitters, its receivers, and the fragile chain that connected a lookout sighting to a message that could move other ships. The technician was not an officer. He was rated for wireless maintenance and shipboard electrics. His work was routine until it was not. He checked valves, contacts, tuning units, and the condition of insulation that did not like salt air. He listened for irregularities in headphones that most men could not describe. He watched a meter needle for hesitation that could vanish the moment a supervisor entered the compartment. On paper, the ship's radio fit within a doctrine that had evolved through hard lessons: short transmissions, clear procedure, encoded traffic when required, silence when possible. Yet in practice, escorts depended on voice circuits, brief signals, and the ability to reach the convoy commodore, other escorts, and shore stations when the situation demanded it. A ship could not fight blind. A ship could not coordinate without a voice. The technician's first concern was minor. A transmitter used for short-range working began to drift under load. It did not fail outright. It softened at the edges. Reports still went out. Acknowledgements still came back. But the output was uneven, and the tuning behaved as if something was warming beyond its normal range. The radio operator on watch called it touchy. He could still get a signal away if he babysat the controls. That was the kind of thing crews learned to live with at sea. There was always a leak, always a vibration, always a piece of equipment that behaved better in daylight than in the damp cold after midnight. The technician did not treat it as normal. He opened the cabinet after the set was made safe and cooled. He inspected the seating of a valve. He checked the condition of wiring near a clamp that had rubbed through its varnish. He measured voltages where the manual told him they should be steady. He found a small inconsistency in the power stage and a hint of intermittent arcing near an aging connector. It looked manageable. It looked like the kind of fix that could be done cleanly in harbour. At sea, the ship did not stop rolling long enough to make delicate work pleasant. Still, he could stabilise it. He could secure the cable run. He could reduce the chance of a full failure. Then he noticed something that did not fit the usual pattern. The drift was more pronounced when the ship transmitted at higher power. It was worse after heavy spray had driven into the superstructure. It was not simply a valve nearing the end of its life. It suggested a path for moisture, or a weakening component that would go from nuisance to silence without warning. He wrote it up in the ship's defect log. He included the symptoms and the conditions. He noted the point at which the transmitter began to lose stability. He described the risk in the cautious language that enlisted specialists used when they wanted to be taken seriously, without sounding alarmist. A minor fault, he called it, because that was the category available. A small issue, because the ship still had other sets. A maintenance concern, because the convoy was already underway, and there was no turning back for a radio that still spoke most of the time. The log moved upward through the normal chain. The petty officer in the radio room read it and nodded. He respected the technician's competence. He also knew how many reports died in paperwork. The signal officer had priorities that were not purely technical. The captain had priorities that were not purely signals. A convoy escort lived by action stations, fuel calculations, and the constant strain of the watch bill. When the technician pressed the point, the answer was practical. The ship had redundancy. Transmitters existed for more than one circuit. If one became unreliable, the operators could shift. If the problem worsened, they would isolate it and carry on. In calm water, such logic might have been enough. In the North Atlantic, calm water was an exception. Over the next days, the convoy moved into harder weather. Wind increased, sea state climbed. The Escorts' bow drove into waves and shipped water that found every imperfect seal. The ship's upper work stayed wet. Salt crept into fittings. The radio room, below and protected, still felt the ship's movement through every rack and panel. The technician noticed new signs. A faint smell of hot insulation that came and went. A crackle that appeared on transmission and vanished on receive. A meter that trembled on a long press of the key. Nothing dramatic occurred. That was what made it dangerous. A slow decline could be dismissed as normal wear. A slow decline could also be the stage before sudden failure. In the convoy's daily rhythm, signals mattered in quiet ways. Course changes had to be passed cleanly. Station changes had to be acknowledged. A sighting report had to reach the right ship before it became stale. If a U-boat periscope was seen, minutes mattered, not hours. The escort group did not have the luxury of perfect radio practice. They balanced silence against necessity. They used codes and brevity. They relied on disciplined operators. Even so, the radio was a constant. At night, the convoy was darker than the sea around it. Navigation lights were masked. Ships kept station by shadow and dim reference points. Lookouts strained for shapes that did not belong. Escorts swept their eyes and their equipment through the black. On one of those nights, a merchant ship in the outer column flashed a brief signal lamp message to an escort. It was routine, and it was urgent in the way routine could become. A straggler had difficulty holding position. There had been a noise in the engine room. The ship was slowing. The escort signalman relayed the message. The radio room prepared to pass it along so the escort commander could decide whether to detach a ship or order the straggler back into line. The convoy's safety depended on cohesion. Stragglers became targets. The technician happened to be nearby, called in for another check because the transmitter had acted up again during an earlier signal. He watched the operator key the set. He watched the meter rise and hesitate. He heard the subtle change in tone that indicated the set was not holding as it should. The signal got out. It was acknowledged. On paper, that would later look like proof that the set was fine. In the room, it looked like a warning that the set was surviving by luck. He made a second entry in the defect log. He tightened his description. He noted that the fault was increasingly sensitive to moisture exposure. He recommended a controlled inspection of the coupling and associated connections at the next possible opportunity. The entry was small. The request was reasonable. The response was silence, not as a deliberate punishment, but as the default state of a ship that had too many demands and too little time. The convoy pushed farther east. The operational picture shifted in ways crews could not fully see. By the spring of 1943, Allied anti-submarine measures were improving. More aircraft coverage, better radar, more escorts, more experience. The U-boat threat was still real, but the balance was changing. That shift did not remove danger. It changed its texture. Submarines adapted. They searched for gaps. They exploited weather. They sought stragglers. They listened for radio errors. The escort's captain received daily instructions and intelligence summaries when available. Sometimes those came through shore relay, sometimes through other ships. Sometimes they did not come at all, because the ocean did not care what the plan required. On a morning of low cloud and broken visibility, the escort group altered its disposition. A report had come in from another convoy, delayed and uncertain, describing a suspected submarine in the area. The escort commander wanted tighter screening on the likely approach routes. That meant more station changes, more short messages, more chances for minor faults to become operational problems. The technician remained in his cycle. Listen, measure, adjust, record. He was not in the tactical plot. He did not make decisions about course or speed. Yet his work was tied to every decision. If the ship could not speak when it needed to, doctrine became a paper shield. Late that day, the convoy's escort executed a brief working signal to coordinate a search pattern after a suspicious radar return. The radar contact was fleeting. The sea was cluttered with returns. An operator could be fooled by wave tops, birds, or reflections. Still, the correct procedure required a response. The technician watched another transmission. This time the set faltered longer. The signal did not fail completely. It was weaker. It was distorted. The other ship acknowledged, but asked for a repeat on a different circuit. The radio operator complied. He shifted to another transmitter and passed the message again. For the moment, the system held. Redundancy saved the procedure, but redundancy had limits, especially when ships were separated by weather and station changes. Afterward, the technician spoke to the petty officer in charge. He did not speak in panic. He spoke as a man who understood how sailors dismiss slow trouble until it became sudden. He recommended that the suspect transmitter be taken out of primary use. He recommended shifting routine traffic away from it. He requested time for a deeper inspection. The petty officer's answer was careful. He agreed in principle. He also knew the ship's schedule and the chain of priorities. Operators would not like losing a familiar set. Officers would not like hearing that the equipment was unreliable when a convoy depended on it. Someone would ask why the problem had not been solved earlier. The technician did not argue. He returned to the equipment. He did what he could within the constraints. He dried what he could reach. He reseated what he could. He reinforced a cable run. He improved a seal as best as improvised material allowed. The ocean remained indifferent. Another night arrived. Visibility dropped again. The convoy's merchant ships held formation as well as they could. Their engines laboured. Spray froze on railings. The Escorts' men moved carefully on deck. In those conditions, attacks could come without warning. A torpedo wake might not be seen. A periscope could be lost in wave shadows. A submarine could fire from the edge of visibility and be gone before the Escorts could respond. The convoy did not need melodrama to be dangerous. It needed only one weakness to align with one enemy opportunity. In the early hours, a distant explosion rolled across the water. A merchant ship had been hit on the convoy's flank. The Escorts' alarm sounded. Stations were taken. Searchlights did not immediately stab the dark because lights could aid the attacker. Instead, Escorts used what they had: lookouts, radar, sound detection. Procedures rehearsed until they became instinct. A contact report had to be made. The escort group needed to coordinate. Other ships needed to know the danger area. A pattern would be ordered, and ships would take stations to prosecute the suspected submarine while the convoy adjusted course and speed. The radio room became a focal point. Operators turned to their circuits. The signal officer demanded clear working traffic. Messages were short, precise, and essential. In that moment, the technician's earlier concern stopped being minor. The primary short-range transmitter was used because it was the one set up for that circuit. The operator keyed. The transmitter responded unevenly. The meter rose, flickered, and then dropped. A second attempt produced only a weak output and a hiss. A third attempt produced a brief surge, then a silence that was not operator error. The operator shifted immediately to the backup set. That set worked, but the shift cost seconds, and seconds in an attack sequence mattered. Messages went out. But the traffic load increased and the room's work became more complex. The ship's internal coordination also depended on communication. Orders flowed from bridge to compartments. Reports came back. The ship's own movements had to align with the escort group's plan. The defective set sat there, quiet, as if it had chosen the worst moment to become honest. The technician opened the cabinet when it was safe enough. He saw moisture where moisture should not have been. He saw evidence of R-ring that had grown from intermittent to destructive. A component had failed, not spectacularly, but decisively enough to take the set out of action. He could not replace it at sea, not with what was available, not while the ship was manoeuvring, while the deck shook, and while the radio room needed every steady hand to keep traffic flowing. The fight outside did not produce a clean result. The convoy's escorts hunted the suspected submarine through the dark and the cluttered sea. They dropped patterns, they listened, they watched, they strained their equipment. Like many anti-submarine actions of the period, the outcome was ambiguous. A contact could be gained and lost. A submarine could be damaged and still escape. A crew could believe they had forced it down, while the enemy drifted away under cover of weather. By morning, the convoy continued. A merchant ship was damaged or lost, depending on the severity of the hit and the success of damage control. The escort group reformed. The operational situation remained unresolved, the way so many convoy nights ended. Inside the escort, the technician faced the quiet consequence of a fault that had been minor until it was not. He did not claim that his set's failure caused the attack. That would have been an exaggerated claim. Convoys were attacked for many reasons. Submarines chose targets by opportunity, weather-shaped outcomes. Yet he could see how the failure had complicated coordination at a critical moment. He could see how a delay, even brief, forced a shift of traffic to other circuits and increased the chance of confusion. When the immediate pressure eased, the signal officer wanted explanations. The ship's captain wanted to know why equipment had failed during an action. Reports had to be written, maintenance logs had to be reviewed. The defect entry the technician had made earlier now mattered, not because it had been acted on, but because it existed. The question was not only technical, it was institutional. Why had the warning not produced a repair opportunity? Why had the set been kept in primary use? Why had the risk been accepted? The technician was not the person with authority to answer those questions. He could only provide evidence. He could show the entries. He could show the failed component. He could describe the pattern of drift, the sensitivity to moisture, and the signs that had preceded failure. The officer's response was restrained. In wartime, tempers flared, but discipline demanded control. The radio room was told to continue operations. The defective set was tagged out. The backup set took the burden. Repairs would wait for port or for a calmer window, neither of which could be scheduled with confidence. Days later, after the convoy reached safer waters and the Escort approached harbour, the technician expected his report to produce a simple outcome: a replacement component, a note of recognition, a reminder that maintenance warnings mattered. In a well-run system, that would have been enough. What followed was quieter. A paperwork trail began. There were forms and signatures and the transfer of responsibility between departments that did not share the same priorities. An entry in a ship's log became a line in a repair docket. A repair docket became part of a larger accounting. In wartime, repair capacity was strained, and minor faults competed with battle damage and urgent refits. The technician's warning did not vanish. It was present, but it was not centered. The institutional focus moved toward categories and schedules. The failure became equipment malfunction during action. The question became whether procedures had been followed. The ship's narrative became a set of official words that needed to fit a format. A short internal inquiry asked whether radio discipline had been maintained, whether alternative circuits had been used correctly, whether the escort commander had received necessary information, whether the failure had materially altered the action. Such inquiries rarely had simple answers. The North Atlantic did not provide laboratory conditions. Officers could point to the fact that the message was eventually transmitted. They could note that redundancy existed and was used. They could argue that the action's outcome was determined by many factors, not by one transmitter. The technician could not dispute those points. He did not need to. His concern was narrower. A set that showed a developing fault had remained in service because the system treated minor as a reason to postpone. A warning had been recorded, and yet nothing had been done until failure forced action. That was not unique to one ship. It was a pattern in many wartime organizations. It was the cost of operating at speed and under pressure. In port, the ship's communications gear was inspected. The failed component was replaced. Seals were improved. Connections were tightened and rerouted. The transmitter returned to service, stable again under test. There was no ceremony for that. There was no public recognition for the technician's earlier insistence. If anything, the episode produced caution among the crew. Warnings could bring attention. Attention could become blame. Blame could land on the wrong shoulders if the paperwork demanded a simple story. The technician was moved to another assignment soon after. Not a punishment in formal terms, not an official reprimand, a reassignment that looked ordinary in a navy that shifted men where it needed them. He was sent to a different ship preparing for sea. His record followed him in the form of small notes and ratings, not in the form of a narrative that captured what had happened. The silence that followed him was not dramatic. It was administrative. It was the lack of a conversation that might have improved practice. No one gathered the technicians and radio operators to say plainly that minor faults in communications equipment were operational hazards. No one issued a fleet-wide lesson drawn from his experience, at least not in a way that carried his name. The institution learned in aggregate slowly through many small failures and many quiet corrections. At sea again, on another vessel, the technician continued the same work. He checked equipment. He listened for irregularities. He wrote cautious entries when something did not behave as it should. He understood the pressure of operations. He also understood how a small fault could become silence at the worst moment. In convoy warfare, silence had meanings. Sometimes it was deliberate to deny an enemy an intercept. Sometimes it was accidental, born of corrosion and vibration and overstretched maintenance. In the latter case, silence could be a gap that no doctrine could fill in time. The broader war at sea moved on. Allied tactics improved. Escort groups gained experience and equipment. Air coverage increased. Submarines faced higher losses. Convoys continued to suffer, but the balance shifted. That shift did not erase the human stories inside the machinery. Radio rooms remained cramped and hot, even in cold latitudes. Operators remained tired. Technicians remained the ones who noticed problems before they became obvious to everyone else. Most of their successes left no dramatic trace. A stable transmitter did not make headlines. A repaired coupling did not appear in official summaries. Yet the ability to send a short message at the right moment was part of how convoys survived. In later years, when reports were written and histories compiled, actions at sea were described through larger units. Convoy numbers, escort group designations, tonnage lost, submarines sunk, those were the terms that fit strategic analysis. The smaller chain of cause and effect inside one ship was harder to preserve. A technician's defect entry could still be found in old logs if someone went looking. It would read like routine maintenance language. It would not announce itself as a turning point. It would not claim to have changed the course of a campaign. It would show instead the quiet reality of naval war. The war depended on procedures and equipment depended on people who noticed what others overlooked. The story's weight lay in that relationship. A trained specialist identified a fault early. He documented it in the proper way. The system absorbed the information and did not act until forced. When failure arrived, the institution explained it in the terms it could manage. The individual moved on, carrying the lesson while the paperwork closed behind him. Such patterns were common across wartime services. They were rarely malicious. They were the product of strain, habit, and the need to keep ships moving. In the North Atlantic, moving was survival. Stopping for maintenance was often impossible. The result was that small risks accumulated, and sometimes they surfaced when the sea was dark and the convoy could not afford confusion. The technician's legacy was not a medal or a citation. It was the example of careful attention under pressure. It was the reminder that communication equipment was not background machinery, but a living system that could fail at the edge of its tolerance. It was the quiet truth that warnings often existed before disasters, written in plain language, waiting for someone with time and authority to act. If you want more documented stories like this, focused on overlooked work and the people history rarely names, subscribe and stay with the channel.